The winter air bit at David Chen's fingers as he rubbed them together outside the Grand Plaza Hotel. At 17, he looked younger than his age, with a frame made slim from skipping too many lunches to practice piano during school breaks. His worn blue backpack hung from one shoulder, containing dog-eared sheet music and a half-eaten sandwich from home. David hadn't planned to stop at the hotel. He was on his way to the public library, where he sometimes used their free piano when the practice rooms weren't booked. But the sudden snow flurry had driven him to seek shelter, and now he stood transfixed by what he saw through the gleaming glass doors. A grand piano. Not just any piano, but a Steinway concert grand that gleamed under soft lobby lights like something from another world. David pressed his nose against the cold glass, fogging it with his breath. The piano sat unattended, its lid raised like an invitation. "Just go in," he whispered to himself. But people like him didn't just walk into places like the Grand Plaza. The doorman wore a coat that probably cost more than his mom's monthly rent. Guests in designer clothes crossed the marble floors, trailing perfume and confidence. David's hands, calloused from hours of practice on their second-hand upright at home, felt rough and out of place even in his imagination. For 3 years he'd been teaching himself to play, using free YouTube tutorials and music sheets printed from websites when he could afford the ink. His piano at home had 5 keys that stuck and one that didn't work at all, but he'd learned to play around its flaws, like navigating the familiar cracks in a sidewalk. A gust of wind pushed against his back as if urging him forward. A woman with a small dog tucked under her arm approached the door, and the doorman swung it open. Warm air rushed out, carrying with it the faint sound of clinking glasses and soft conversation. Without giving himself time to reconsider, David slipped in behind her. The lobby smelled of vanilla and something floral. The marble floor reflected his faded jeans and scuffed sneakers as he tried to look like he belonged. Heat rushed to his face as he realized how out of place he was, but nobody seemed to notice him. Hotel staff bustled about, guests checked their phones, and a group of business people laughed near a seating area. And there, in a small alcove near tall windows overlooking the snowy street, sat the piano. David approached it slowly, as if it might vanish if he moved too quickly. Up close it was even more beautiful, the black surface polished to a mirror shine, the keys pristine ivory and ebony. He glanced around. Nobody was watching. Nobody cared about a skinny teenager hovering near the piano. His fingers itched to touch the keys. Growing up in a cramped apartment with thin walls meant David had learned to play with headphones plugged into their electric keyboard. When they couldn't afford to repair it, he'd practiced silently, pressing keys that made no sound and hearing the music only in his head. Then came the miracle. His uncle's friend was moving and couldn't take his old upright piano. It was out of tune and missing a pedal, but it was real. David had cried the first time he played it, the sound vibrating through his fingertips in a way no electric keyboard could match. Now he stood before an instrument worth more than everything his family owned. "Can I help you?" The voice startled him. A woman in a hotel uniform with a name tag reading Lisa looked at him with polite suspicion. David swallowed. Is it okay if I play? Just for a few minutes?" Lisa seemed surprised by the question. "The piano? Well, I'm not sure. We usually have professionals scheduled for evening performances." She looked him over, taking in his worn jacket and nervous posture. "I've been playing for years," David said, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. "I won't disturb anyone, I can play quietly." Lisa hesitated. David could see her weighing the risk of letting someone like him touch their expensive piano against the possibility that he might actually know what he was doing. "Let me check with my manager," she finally said, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Wait here, please." As Lisa walked away, David felt his courage beginning to slip. He should leave. This was a stupid idea. People from his neighborhood didn't wander into luxury hotels asking to play their pianos. His mom worked 2 jobs cleaning offices and homes just like this to keep their lights on. What would she think if she saw him here acting like he belonged? But then he looked again at the piano. 3 years ago, David had been walking past a music store when he heard someone playing through the open door. The melody had stopped him cold on the sidewalk. He'd stood there for 20 minutes, listening, before gathering the nerve to go inside and ask what the piece was. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the store owner had told him. When David had asked how much lessons cost and heard the answer, he'd known it was impossible. But the store owner had seen something in his eyes and shown him where to find free tutorials online. Since that day, music had become his escape. When his parents argued about money, when the heating broke in winter, when kids at school made fun of his second-hand clothes, he disappeared into melodies. He practiced on library pianos, on a keyboard app on his phone when nothing else was available, and late at night on their broken piano with the sound barely audible so as not to wake his little sister or parents. Lisa was returning now, followed by a tall man in a sharp suit who looked about as excited as someone heading to a dental appointment. The manager, David guessed, feeling his heart sink at the man's expression. "You want to play our piano?" the manager asked, not bothering to introduce himself. His tone made it clear he was expecting to say no. "Yes, sir," David replied, straightening his posture slightly. "Just for a few minutes, I promise I know how to play." "This is a Steinway Model D concert grand," the manager said, as if explaining something to a child. "It's valued at more than $150,000. David felt his face grow hot. "I understand, sir. I'll be careful." The manager exchanged a look with Lisa, who gave a small shrug. A couple of guests had slowed their walk across the lobby, watching the interaction with mild interest. "What do you play?" the manager asked, crossing his arms. "Chopin, Beethoven, some Liszt," David answered. "I've been working on Chopin's Ballade No. 1 recently." Something flickered in the manager's eyes, surprise, maybe disbelief. He gave a short laugh and turned to Lisa. "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, clearly amused by the absurdity of the claim. David felt a flash of determination cut through his embarrassment. He knew what people like this thought when they looked at him. A poor kid with no formal training who probably wanted to bang out heart and soul on their expensive piano. But music didn't care about where you came from or what you wore. "May I?" David asked, gesturing to the piano bench. The manager waved his hand in a dismissive gesture. 5 minutes, he said, and nothing too loud. David nodded, setting his backpack carefully on the floor. He sat down at the bench, adjusting it slightly. The keys felt different under his fingers, responsive in a way his home piano never was. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the hotel lobby faded away. There was no manager watching with skepticism, no Lisa hovering nearby ready to intervene, no curious glances from hotel guests. There was only David and the piano, the way it had always been. He began to play. Richard Winters was having a terrible morning. The hotel's quarterly budget meeting had run long. The head chef had threatened to quit over a dispute with a supplier, and now his coffee had gone cold while he dealt with a plumbing issue in the East Wing bathrooms. 20 years in the hotel, business had taught him that problems never arrived alone. They came in waves, usually when important guests were expected. And today, the hotel was preparing for the arrival of a famous pianist who would be staying for a week-long residency at the nearby concert hall. The last thing Richard needed was some random teenager messing with their prized Steinway, Mr. Winters. Lisa's voice crackled through his radio just as he was finally returning to his office. "There's a young man in the lobby asking to play the piano." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "Tell him it's not a public piano, Lisa." "I did, sir, but he seems very eager. Says he's been playing for years." Richard sighed. The hotel policy was clear. The piano was for scheduled performances by professionals, not casual visitors. But he'd learned over the years that sometimes it was faster to handle these situations in person than to send messages back and forth. "I'll be right there," he said, setting his cold coffee down on his desk. As he made his way through the staff corridors toward the lobby, Richard mentally prepared his polite but firm refusal. The Grand Plaza Hotel had a reputation to maintain. The piano had been specially selected by a renowned concert pianist who had performed at their New Year's gala 5 years ago, and since then, it had become something of a status symbol for the hotel. Casual players weren't allowed to touch it. Richard stepped into the lobby and immediately spotted Lisa standing by the piano alcove with a thin teenager in a worn jacket. Even from a distance, he could tell the boy didn't belong. Guests of the Grand Plaza didn't wear faded jeans with holes that came from wear rather than design, or carry backpacks held together with safety pins. "Good afternoon," Richard said as he approached, straightening the lapels of his tailored suit. He noted the boy's worn sneakers and the way he kept fidgeting with his hands. Probably some kid who had learned for Elise and thought that made him a pianist. "This is Mr. Winters, our hotel manager," Lisa said to the boy, then turned to Richard. "This is David. He was wondering if he could play the piano for a few minutes." "You want to play our piano?" Richard asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. The question was merely a formality before he would explain why that wasn't possible. "Yes, sir," the boy replied, standing a little straighter. "Just for a few minutes. I promise I know how to play." Something in the boy's tone caught Richard's attention. Not entitlement, but a quiet determination. Still, Richard had heard similar claims before, usually from parents wanting to show off their children's modest skills to a captive audience of hotel guests. "This is a Steinway Model D concert grand," Richard said, emphasizing each word. "It's valued at more than $150,000. He watched the boy's face redden but was surprised when he didn't back down. "I understand, sir." "I'll be careful," the teenager said. Richard exchanged a glance with Lisa, who gave a small shrug as if to say, "What's the harm?" Richard noticed that a few guests had paused nearby, watching the exchange with mild interest. The last thing he wanted was to create a scene in the lobby, especially with several board members still in the building after the morning's meeting. "What do you play?" Richard asked, crossing his arms. He expected the boy to name some pop song or simple classical piece taught in first-year piano lessons. "Chopin, Beethoven, some Liszt," the boy answered without hesitation. "I've been working on Chopin's Ballade No. 1 recently." Richard couldn't help the laugh that escaped him. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 was one of the most technically challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. He knew because his ex-wife had been a classical pianist who had struggled with that very piece for months. There was no way this scruffy teenager with no formal training, and Richard was certain he had none, could play such a piece. "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here," Richard announced loudly to Lisa and a bellhop who was passing by with a luggage cart. The bellhop, Tom, snickered appreciatively. The boy, David, didn't react to the mockery except for a slight tightening around his eyes. Richard felt a twinge of guilt but pushed it aside. He dealt with unreasonable requests all day. Sometimes humor was the only way to stay sane. "May I?" David asked, gesturing to the piano bench. Richard considered sending him away, but calculated that a quick demonstration of the boy's limited abilities would end this faster than an argument. Besides, the small audience that had gathered seemed curious, and Richard prided himself on the hotel's reputation for unexpected moments of charm. 5 minutes, Richard said with a dismissive wave, "and nothing too loud." As the boy set his backpack down and adjusted the bench, Richard prepared to cut him off as soon as he confirmed his suspicions. He'd have Lisa bring the boy a hot chocolate in the cafe as a consolation prize, and that would be that. A small act of kindness to balance out the public rejection. Richard was not a cruel man, just a practical one who had learned that running a luxury hotel meant maintaining certain standards. The boy closed his eyes for a moment, and Richard resisted the urge to check his watch. He had a full schedule today, including a meeting with the event coordinator about the welcome reception for that visiting pianist, the reception that would feature this very piano, which was why Richard was particularly protective of it right now. Richard had grown up in a musical family. His mother had taught piano, his father had sung in a community choir, and his brother had played cello in their city's youth orchestra. Richard himself had attempted several instruments before accepting that his talents lay elsewhere. But he knew enough about music to recognize skill when he heard it, and he was certain he was about to hear a stumbling rendition of a piece far beyond this boy's capabilities. The first notes changed everything. David's fingers touched the keys with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his nervous energy from moments before. The opening G minor chord of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 resonated through the lobby with perfect weight, not too heavy, not too light. Richard felt his smug smile freeze on his face as the boy moved into the melody, handling the deceptive simplicity of the opening with a maturity that made Richard suddenly unsure of his judgment. When the piece transitioned into its more technical sections, Richard expected the boy to falter. Instead, David's hands moved across the keyboard with increasing confidence. His technique wasn't flawless. Richard could hear small imperfections that a professional would have smoothed out, but there was something else in the playing that made those imperfections irrelevant. Richard had attended countless piano performances over the years. He'd heard technically perfect renditions that left him cold and simple pieces that had moved him deeply. As he listened to David play, he recognized what was happening. This wasn't just skill. This was emotion translated directly into sound. The lobby had fallen unusually quiet. The normal hum of conversation had ceased as guests paused to listen. Even the staff had stopped their tasks, standing still with trays in hand or paperwork forgotten. Lisa stood wide-eyed beside him, and Tom the bellhop had abandoned his luggage cart entirely. Richard found himself moving closer to the piano, drawn by the music that now filled the space completely. He watched David's face as he played, eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music, seemingly unaware of the audience that was growing around him. The boy's entire demeanor had transformed. The nervous teenager had vanished, replaced by someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was doing. As the piece built toward its climactic sections, Richard noticed a woman step out of the elevator, stop abruptly and close her eyes to listen. A businessman set down his phone mid-call. Two housekeepers appeared in a service doorway, dishcloth still in hand. Richard had heard this piece performed by world-class pianists in concert halls. But something about hearing it here, in his lobby, played by this unlikely boy on a random Tuesday morning, made it feel new. The music carried something raw and honest that professional performances sometimes lost in their polished perfection. Standing there, watching David's hands dance across the keyboard, Richard remembered why he had fallen in love with the hotel business in the first place. It wasn't the luxury or the prestige, it was the possibility of moments like this. Unexpected human connections. Stories that couldn't be planned, and as the piece moved into its final dramatic section, Richard became aware of a strange feeling building in his chest, a mixture of embarrassment at his dismissive attitude and something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time: humility. The world had disappeared for David. There was no hotel lobby, no watchful manager, no audience forming around him, only the music. His fingers found the keys with a certainty that came from thousands of hours of practice, from playing this piece so many times that it lived in his muscles and bones. Each note of Chopin's ballade flowed into the next, like a story being told. David had first heard this piece on a borrowed pair of headphones when he was 14, sitting on the fire escape of their apartment building, because the walls were too thin and his dad was trying to sleep after a night shift. The music had opened something inside him, a door to a world where beauty existed despite everything. When the piece reached its thundering climax, David leaned into the keyboard, his body swaying with the music. On his old piano at home, he had to hold back, mindful of the thin walls and the neighbors who worked early shifts. But here, on this magnificent instrument, he could finally play the way he heard the music in his head, with all the power and delicacy it deserved. David didn't notice how the cleaning staff had paused in their duties, dusters and vacuum cleaners forgotten. He didn't see the businessman who had diverted from his path to the elevator, briefcase dangling forgotten from his hand. He didn't notice the family with two small children who had stopped their check-in process mid-sentence, the parents now standing with hands on their children's shoulders as they listened. The revolving door at the hotel entrance continued to turn as people from the street came in. Drawn by the music that spilled onto the sidewalk, a taxi driver held the door for his passenger, but followed her inside instead of returning to his cab. Two young women with shopping bags stood transfixed just inside the doorway. The music filled every corner of the grand lobby, bouncing off marble surfaces and crystal chandeliers. It transformed the space from a place of transient luxury into something sacred, a concert hall where something rare and precious was unfolding. In the middle of it all, David played as if his life depended on it. Maybe it did. This wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration of who he was beneath all the things the world saw when they looked at him. The worn clothes, the rough address, the lack of formal training. The music said, "This is who I really am." Richard Winters stood frozen, his earlier smugness replaced by disbelief. He had heard professional pianists perform in this very lobby during special events, pianists with advanced degrees and international awards, but none had silenced a room quite like this. The boy's technique wasn't perfect. Richard could hear small hesitations and occasional notes that weren't precisely where they should be. But there was something in his playing that went beyond technique, something that reached through the music and grabbed you by the heart. Lisa stood beside Richard, her eyes wide. "I almost sent him away," she whispered, though she needn't have bothered to lower her voice. No one was paying attention to anything but the music. "So did I," Richard admitted. As the piece approached the section that Richard knew was the most technically demanding, a whirlwind of notes that required not just skill, but courage, he found himself holding his breath. This was where most amateur pianists faltered, where the music could fall apart under fingers not ready for its challenges. David's tempo slowed slightly, a brief acknowledgement of the mountain he was about to climb. Then he plunged forward, his hands flying across the keyboard in a blur. There were imperfections, a smudged note here, a slight hesitation there, but he never stopped, never lost the thread of the music. Richard felt goosebumps rise on his arms. He had misjudged this boy so completely that it made him wonder what else he might be wrong about. Near the front desk, an elderly couple who had been checking in now stood with their suitcases beside them, the woman with tears running unchecked down her face. The husband reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "Our son used to play this," Richard overheard the woman whisper to her husband. "Remember?" A group of business people who had been heading to a meeting in the conference center now clustered at the edge of the lobby, their phones out not to take calls but to record the unexpected performance. The hotel chef, Paolo, had emerged from the kitchen still wearing his white coat, drawn by the music that had reached even the back areas of the hotel. He caught Richard's eye across the lobby and gave a small nod as if to say, "You did good letting this happen." But Richard hadn't let this happen. He had merely failed to prevent it. The distinction suddenly seemed important to him. As the piece neared its conclusion, building toward its final dramatic resolution, Richard noticed more details about the boy that he had missed earlier. The careful way he had placed his backpack as if it contained something fragile, the small hole in the side of his sneaker that had been covered with what looked like black marker, the ink stains on his fingers that spoke of hours spent copying sheet music by hand. The world had been quick to dismiss this boy based on appearances, and Richard had been part of that world. What would have happened if he'd sent David away before he'd had a chance to play? A painful question with no good answer. The final chords of the piece rang out, powerful, definitive statements followed by gentle echoes that seemed to ask a question the music couldn't quite resolve. David's hands hovered above the keys for a moment as if reluctant to break the spell. Then slowly he lowered them to his lap and opened his eyes. The lobby erupted in applause. People who normally passed through this space with practiced indifference were now smiling, clapping, turning to strangers to share their amazement. "Did you hear that?" "Who is he?" "That was incredible." David blinked, looking startled to find himself surrounded by so many people. The private world of his music had been so complete that he seemed genuinely surprised to discover he had an audience. A flush crept up his neck as he realized everyone was applauding for him. Richard watched as David ducked his head shyly, clearly unused to this kind of attention. There was no bow, no practiced acknowledgement of applause like a trained performer might give. Just a boy who looked both pleased and overwhelmed by the response. In that moment, Richard remembered his careless words from earlier. "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here." He'd said it as a joke, certain it would never happen. Now, with the applause still filling the lobby, Richard felt a strange compulsion. Not from embarrassment or because anyone remembered his boast. Most hadn't heard it, and those who had were too caught up in the moment to recall it. No, this was something else. A recognition that sometimes life humbled you in ways you never expected. An acknowledgement that this boy, whom he had been ready to dismiss without a second thought, possessed a gift that deserved genuine respect. Before he could talk himself out of it, Richard stepped forward and, as the applause began to fade, slowly lowered himself to one knee beside the piano. It wasn't a theatrical gesture. He didn't drop dramatically or make a show of it. It was a quiet, dignified movement, as sincere as he could make it. David looked at him, confusion clear on his face. "You said you could play," Richard said simply. "I didn't believe you. I was wrong." Around them, most of the hotel guests were still focused on David, but Lisa and Tom the bellhop, who had heard Richard's earlier joke, exchanged surprised glances. Richard didn't care. Some promises, even those made in jest, deserved to be kept. The applause had faded now, replaced by a buzz of conversation as people discussed what they had just witnessed. But a pocket of quiet remained around the piano, where a boy from the wrong side of town and a hotel manager accustomed to judging people at a glance were having a moment of unexpected connection. "Thank you for letting me play," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard shook his head. "No, thank you for playing." He rose to his feet, feeling oddly lighter than he had in years. "Would you play something else?" David's eyes widened. "Really, I can play more?" "Please," Richard said. And for the first time that day, maybe the first time in months, his smile contained no trace of his usual professional polish. It was entirely genuine. David's hands hovered over the keys again, this time with a new awareness of the people watching him. The confidence he had felt while playing Chopin wavered for a moment as he looked around at the crowd that had gathered. These weren't the usual people who heard him play. His mom with her tired smile after a long shift, his little sister who sometimes fell asleep on the couch to his music, or the occasional neighbor who stopped by with compliments that always sounded surprised. These were people who probably attended real concerts, who knew what good music was supposed to sound like. The thought made his hands tremble slightly. "Whatever you'd like to play," Richard said, noticing David's hesitation. The manager's voice was different now, softer, without the edge of impatience that had been there before. David took a deep breath and decided to play something that had always calmed his own nerves. His fingers found the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece so familiar to him that he could play it with his eyes closed. The gentle, flowing melody filled the lobby, different from the drama of the Chopin but no less captivating. As he played, David felt his confidence returning. This piece was like an old friend, one that had kept him company on nights when their apartment felt too crowded, when the weight of everything his family didn't have pressed down on him. He'd practiced it in the school music room during lunch breaks on a keyboard with missing keys, and now on this perfect instrument that responded to his lightest touch. The hotel guests had formed a loose semicircle around the piano. Some had taken seats in nearby chairs, settling in as if for a formal concert. Others stood with drinks in hand, their business meetings or vacation plans temporarily forgotten. A few held up phones to record the unexpected performance. Richard had stepped back, giving David space, but remained close enough to signal that this performance had his approval. His earlier embarrassment had been replaced by something that looked like pride, as if he had discovered David himself. Hotel staff moved quietly through the crowd, their usual tasks adapted to avoid disrupting the music. As David transitioned into the piece's famous middle section, where the melody climbs like moonlight rising over water, he noticed a tall woman in a charcoal gray suit make her way to the front of the crowd. Something about her commanded attention. The way she stood, the focus with which she listened. David found himself playing for her, wanting to get every note right. When Clair de Lune came to its gentle conclusion, the applause was different than before, more knowing, more appreciative of the technical skill required for the piece's deceptive simplicity. David smiled shyly, still unused to this kind of reception. Before the applause had fully died away, someone called out, "Play something else." "Yes, please," another voice added. Something lively. The request should have made David nervous, but instead, he felt a strange new confidence. This was what he had always dreamed of, people wanting to hear his music, not just tolerating it. He launched into Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, a showpiece that he'd been working on for months. It was still rough in places, but the energy of the piece and its playful shifts between moods made it a crowd pleaser. People began to tap their feet and nod along with the music's driving rhythm. A young girl, no more than 5 or 6, started to dance at the edge of the crowd until her mother gently stilled her. David caught the child's eye and smiled, playing the next section with extra flair that made her giggle. The lunch hour had come and gone, but nobody seemed in a hurry to leave. The hotel cafe had begun serving drinks to the audience, turning the impromptu concert into an event. A reserved sign had been discreetly removed from the piano by one of the staff members, as if acknowledging that today's schedule had been pleasantly derailed. When David finished the list, breathing hard from the exertion of the piece's demanding finale, the tall woman in the charcoal suit approached the piano. Up close, David could see that she was older than he'd first thought, probably in her 50s, with short silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. "You play with remarkable emotion for someone so young," she said. Her voice was deep and carried the hint of an accent David couldn't place. "How long have you been studying?" "I don't really study," David admitted, suddenly aware of how strange that might sound to someone who clearly knew music. "I mean, not with a teacher. I watch videos and practice whenever I can." The woman's eyebrows rose. "Self-taught? All of this?" David nodded, feeling his face grow warm. "My family can't afford lessons, but the library has books and there are people online who explain techniques." "Extraordinary," the woman murmured. "And how old are you?" 17, she seemed to make a decision. Reaching into her suit jacket, she pulled out a small business card and handed it to David. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Voss. I'm the Director of Education Programs for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra." David stared at the card in his hand, not quite believing what he was seeing. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra was one of the best in the world. He had never been able to afford tickets, but he had stood outside the concert hall sometimes, listening to the muffled sounds of rehearsals through service doors left slightly ajar. "We have a young artist program," Dr. Voss continued. "Full scholarships for exceptional talents who might not otherwise have access to formal training. We hold auditions twice a year." She paused, studying David's face. "Our next round is in 2 weeks. I would very much like you to come and play for the selection committee." David opened his mouth but found no words. A scholarship? To study with professional musicians? It seemed impossible, like something that happened in movies but not in real life. Certainly not in his life. Richard had approached and now stood nearby, listening to the conversation with undisguised interest. "He'll be there," the hotel manager said when David remained speechless. Dr. Voss turned to Richard with a polite but reserved smile. "And you are?" "Richard Winters, hotel manager," he replied, then added with unexpected humility, "and apparently a poor judge of talent at first glance." Dr. Voss nodded, seeming to understand something unspoken between them. She turned back to David. "The address is on the card. 2 Tuesdays from now, 4 p.m. Prepare 3 pieces of your choice. 1 should demonstrate technical ability, 1 lyricism, and 1 your personal interpretation of a well-known work." She smiled. "Based on what I heard today, I'd say you already have suitable pieces in your repertoire." David finally found his voice. "Thank you. I'll be there. I promise." As Dr. Voss moved away, rejoining colleagues at the far side of the lobby, David sat stunned on the piano bench, the business card clutched in his hand like a ticket to another world. Richard cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "it seems we should discuss some arrangements." David looked up, confused. "Arrangements?" "For practice," Richard explained. "You'll need a proper piano between now and your audition. This one," he gestured to the Steinway, "is at your disposal every morning before we open to the public. 7 to 9 a.m. Really?" David's eyes widened. "You'd let me practice here?" "It would be my privilege," Richard said, and it was clear from his expression that he meant it. "Also, we should talk about transportation to your audition. Perhaps a hotel car could—" "Mr. Winters," a voice called from across the lobby. "The Hendersons have arrived early for their suite. And there's an issue with the—" "One moment," Richard called back, holding up a hand without taking his eyes off David. "This is important." David looked down at the card again, running his thumb over the embossed lettering of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra logo. For years he had played in stolen moments, before school when no one else was awake, in empty classrooms during lunch periods, late at night with the volume turned low. He had played because music was the one thing that made sense in a world that often didn't. He had never imagined it could lead to something more. "Why are you doing this?" David asked Richard quietly. Richard considered the question for a moment. "Because talent deserves a chance," he said finally. "And because I was wrong about you. Perhaps helping you is a way to be less wrong in the future." Around them, the crowd had begun to disperse, The unexpected concert was ending, reality reasserting itself. Guests remembered appointments, staff returned to duties, the everyday rhythm of the hotel resumed. But something had changed, something that couldn't be undone. David carefully placed the business card in his wallet, where it sat next to the only other card he carried. His library card, worn soft at the edges from years of use. 2 keys to different kinds of treasures. Will you play one more? Richard asked. Before you go? David nodded and turned back to the keys, his fingers finding the opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. As he played the familiar melody, he thought about how a single hour had somehow changed everything, how one door carelessly opened had led to another, and perhaps another beyond that. The future hummed with possibility, bright and unknown, like music not yet played, but already waiting within the keys. 6 months later, David stood backstage in the Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom, adjusting his borrowed bow tie for the 3rd time. The sleeves of his tuxedo, also borrowed, felt stiff and unfamiliar against his wrists. Through the heavy curtain, he could hear the murmur of hundreds of voices as Chicago's wealthy and influential citizens mingled, sipping champagne and nibbling on appetizers that cost more than what his family spent on groceries in a week. "Stop fidgeting," his little sister Anna whispered from beside him. At 12 years old, she wore a blue dress their mother had spent 3 evenings altering to fit her properly. "You look fine." "I don't belong here," David whispered back, though he knew it wasn't really true anymore. In the past 6 months, so much had changed that sometimes he hardly recognized his own life. The audition with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's education committee had gone better than he could have imagined. He'd played Chopin, Debussy, and a piece by Piazzolla that he'd fallen in love with after hearing it on a documentary. When he finished, there had been a long moment of silence before Dr. Voss had smiled and simply said, "Welcome to the program." Since then, David's life had become a whirlwind of proper lessons, theory classes, and practice sessions on instruments he'd only dreamed of playing before. He'd been given a key to a practice room with a baby grand piano that he could use whenever he wasn't in school. For the first time, he had teachers who understood what music meant to him, who pushed him harder because they saw what he could become, not what he lacked. But tonight wasn't about his scholarship or his future career. Tonight was about giving back. The idea had come from Richard Winters during one of David's early morning practice sessions at the hotel piano. "What if," the manager had suggested, watching David work through a particularly difficult passage of a Rachmaninoff concerto, "we organized an event? Something to raise funds for music education in neighborhoods like yours?" David had stopped playing. "You mean like a charity concert?" Richard had nodded, warming to the idea. "The Grand Plaza hosts a major fundraising gala every spring. Usually we bring in entertainment from outside, musicians, comedians, that sort of thing. But this year, what if you were our featured performer?" At first, David had laughed at the suggestion. Him, playing for a room full of people who probably attended the symphony regularly? But Richard had been serious. "These people pay thousands for their tickets," he'd explained. "They want something special, something with a story. Your story, David. From practicing on a broken piano to earning a full scholarship, all because you had the courage to walk into a hotel and ask to play." Now, standing backstage and listening to the growing noise of the crowd, David wasn't sure if courage was the right word for what he'd felt that day. Desperation, maybe, a hunger to touch a real piano just once. He certainly hadn't planned on any of what followed. "5 minutes, Mr. Chen," a staff member said, poking her head through the curtain. David nodded, trying to calm his racing heart. He'd performed several times since earning his scholarship, small recitals for other students, a community concert at a local church, even a brief appearance at a CSO donor event. But nothing like this. Tonight's gala had sold out weeks ago, with tickets going for record prices after Richard had spread the story of the young pianist he'd discovered in his lobby. "I think I'm going to be sick," David muttered. "You'll be fine," his mother said, straightening his collar. She looked beautiful tonight in a simple black dress borrowed from a cousin, her hair styled by one of the hotel staff who had volunteered her services. "Just play like you do at home. Play for us." His father, uncomfortable in his only suit but standing tall with pride, added, "Remember when you used to practice with those paper keys you drew and taped to the kitchen table, before we got the keyboard?" David smiled at the memory. He'd been so desperate to play that he'd drawn a piano keyboard on sheets of paper and practiced fingering silently, hearing the music only in his head. "Mr. Chen?" It was Richard stepping behind the curtain to join them. Unlike 6 months ago, he greeted David's parents with genuine warmth, shaking his father's hand and complimenting his mother on her dress. In the months since their first meeting, Richard had become a regular visitor to their apartment, initially to coordinate David's practice schedule, then later just to check in on his progress or drop off sheet music he thought David might enjoy. "Ready?" Richard asked, noticing David's nervous expression. "Not really," David admitted. Richard laughed. "Nobody ever is. But there's something you should see before you go on." He guided David to a small gap in the curtains where he could peek out at the ballroom without being seen. The space had been transformed for tonight's event. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables decorated with white flowers and silver candelabras. The wealthy patrons of the arts were dressed in their finest, jewelry catching the light as they gestured and laughed, but that wasn't what Richard wanted him to see. "Back corner," Richard directed quietly. David shifted his gaze and felt his breath catch. There, at tables clearly marked as sponsored by the hotel, sat dozens of children and teenagers, all dressed in their best clothes, all looking slightly out of place among the wealth surrounding them. He recognized some faces from his own neighborhood, from the community center where he sometimes helped with homework, from the public school he still attended. "Who are they?" David asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The first beneficiaries of tonight's fundraiser," Richard explained. "Kids from your old neighborhood who've shown interest in music but haven't had access to lessons or instruments. Starting next month, they'll all be part of the new weekend music program at the community center, fully funded for at least the next 3 years, based on the donations we've already received." David felt something tighten in his chest. 6 months ago, he had been just like them, full of love for music but with no path forward, no way to develop whatever raw talent he might have. Now he was going to play for them to show them what was possible. 2 minutes, Mr. Chen," the staff member called again. Richard squeezed his shoulder. "I'll be introducing you. Any requests?" David thought for a moment. "Don't make me sound too special. I was just a kid who wanted to play a good piano." Richard nodded, though his smile suggested he didn't entirely agree with that assessment. As Richard slipped away to take the stage, David's family gathered around him for a final group hug. "We're so proud," his mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Go show them who you are," his father added. David took a deep breath and moved to the curtain entrance, listening as Richard's voice filled the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your generosity tonight. Many of you have heard the story of how 6 months ago, a young man walked into our lobby and asked to play our piano." Richard told the story simply but effectively. There was laughter when he mentioned his dismissive attitude, a hush when he described David's playing, and murmurs of appreciation when he explained how that chance encounter had led to tonight's fundraiser, which had already raised over $200,000 for music education in underserved communities. "So it is my great honor to introduce to you the young man who reminded me, and perhaps all of us, that talent can be found in the most unexpected places, if only we take the time to listen. Please welcome David Chen." The applause was thunderous as David stepped onto the stage. The bright lights momentarily blinded him, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out Richard standing to one side, applauding with genuine pride. Near the back, he saw the children from his neighborhood watching him with wide-eyed wonder, and at a table near the front, Dr. Voss from the symphony nodded encouragingly. David took his place at the grand piano that had been positioned at center stage. It wasn't the same one from the lobby. This was an even more magnificent instrument brought in specially for tonight's performance. He adjusted the bench, took a deep breath, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment, he was back in that lobby 6 months ago, a nervous teenager in worn sneakers who just wanted to touch a beautiful piano. So much had changed since then, and yet the most important thing remained the same. When he played, the music still carried him to a place where none of the other stuff mattered. As he began to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto, Nauertusen, the piece he'd chosen to open the program, David caught Richard's eye in the audience. The hotel manager gave him a small nod, and they shared a smile that acknowledged everything that had passed between them. A careless joke, a moment of unexpected beauty, a promise kept. and a future forever changed.